Here we're going to tie a fly called a Mercury Baetis. First thing I went ahead and did was added a clear mercury bead to the front of the hook. It's basically just a small glass Midge bead. Next thing we're going to do is we're just going to take some strung hackle, basically some cheap basic hackle, and I'm going to strip off a clump of feathers or fibers here that about a dozen or so of them. I try to make the tips as even as possible, and if you don't like the way one of them looks, I just get back on the feather here. I'm going to strip off another clump. I just even up the tips and then just rip them right off of there. We want this tail to be about half of the length of the shank of the hook, so I just kind of roughly eyeball it, measure it, and I'm going to tie it in. As I tie this clump of feathers in, I want to hold them up off of the shank of the hook. This way they get tied in right on top of the shank, which is what I want. I don't want it to roll from side to side. There we go. Once I have them tied in, I can trim the excess off the front there, tag ends. Now the next thing to do is to take some superfine dubbing in a olive color or a blue and olive color. The blue and olive is a little bit darker than olive. I'm using just a plain olive here. A little bit lighter in color. It'll actually get darker once it gets wet and hits the water. All I'm going to do is just build a nice smooth tapered body, and I got to be very careful not to overdo it with this fly. This fly is meant to be tied fairly slim, so if you get too carried away you'll actually make the fly too bulky. And I go about 2/3 of the way up the hook. Now the next thing is I'm going to take a chunk of Antron yarn. I'm going to just tie that right on top of the shank of the hook, and I'm using black for the Mercury Baetis here. And I'm going to trim out the front and leave just the fibers hanging off the back. Now once I've got those tied in, I'm going to dub a thorax with the same dubbing, just some olive superfine dubbing. And you also want to dub this body nice and tight. You don't want it to be shaggy. This fly was designed to be slender, not shaggy, just like a mayfly nymph. And I'm going to dub this thorax ever so slightly bulkier than the body. The thorax is a little bit more round, a little bit more mass to it, but you also got to be careful not to overdo it. Just a little bit there. Now I'm going to take that Antron, I'm going to pull it over the top of the thorax, and I'm going to lay down 3 wraps, and I'm going to split that Antron. I'm going to let half a dozen to a dozen fibers or so hang off to one side here, and I'm going to pull them rearward. I'm going to lay down a couple of wraps, and I do the same thing on the other side. I'm creating the legs with this Antron, and then you can trim out the rest of it. It's on in the middle of the hook here. Once you've got those lashed down to each side, you can go ahead and whip finish. Clean up the head there. Now you're going to trim the legs, which are going to be slightly longer than the casing. So I just pull them both together, slightly longer than the casing. And there are your legs. Very effective fly, very easy to tie. We use it quite a bit here on our tailwaters out here in Colorado. Picky fish in Lake Cheeseman Canyon on the South Platte. And that's all there is to a Mercury Baetis.